The late summer air of 1944 clung heavy with the smell of salt and sweat. Sergeant Haruto Nakamura crouched low among the shattered palms, clutching the worn strap of his rifle, though the weapon had long since lost its promise of survival. Around him, the jungle was silent, broken only by the distant hum of engines and the occasional burst of gunfire that seemed to echo from another world. He had heard the stories, that surrender was dishonor worse than death, that the Americans treated captured soldiers with cruelty beyond imagination. But now, with the island's defense in ruins and his unit scattered like leaves in a storm, the choice between life and death pressed down upon him with unbearable weight. The sudden crack of branches behind him brought him to attention. Private Kenji Sato, no older than 20, stumbled into the clearing. His uniform was ripped, his face hollow from days without food. He looked at Haruto with eyes that carried both fear and relief. "They've surrounded us," he whispered. "We can't hold out anymore." His voice trembled with exhaustion, yet there was a strange undercurrent of hope in it, an unspoken plea to lay down arms. Haruto hesitated, the teachings of his commanders and the voices of his ancestors ringing in his mind. But the growing sound of boots in the undergrowth forced the decision from him. Slowly, he placed the rifle on the ground. The Americans emerged cautiously, rifles trained, but not with the cruelty Haruto had imagined. They barked commands he barely understood, gesturing with sharp movements of their hands. Haruto raised his arms, his heart hammering in his chest, and Kenji followed. The moment was surreal. Surrender was supposed to feel like death, yet here he still breathed. Bound and marched with other prisoners gathered from the remnants of the battle, Haruto found himself studying the faces of his captors. They were young men too, their expressions not filled with rage but with a strange mixture of vigilance and weariness. Days turned into a blur as the prisoners were transported, first across the sea in the belly of a ship, then across the vast American landscape by train. Haruto pressed his face to the barred window whenever he could, marveling at the sprawling towns, the endless fields, the casual rhythm of a country untouched by the devastation he had seen. Children waved at the trains, unaware or unconcerned that behind the steel bars sat men once sworn to kill their fathers and brothers. When the train finally screeched to a halt in the middle of what seemed like nowhere, the prisoners were herded into a sprawling camp ringed with fences and watchtowers. Haruto braced himself for the cruelty he had been taught to expect: harsh labor, beatings, starvation. Instead, he was given clean clothes, a bed with a mattress softer than any he had, slept on in the barracks, and food that filled his stomach until he felt almost guilty. Kenji, chewing slowly on a piece of bread, muttered, "This is a trick. They fatten us before the punishment comes." But as days passed, the punishment never arrived. Instead, there was routine, roll calls, chores, and long stretches of idleness. For men who had lived by discipline and the edge of a blade, the emptiness was unbearable. Haruto lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories of the battlefield, waiting for the cruelty he thought inevitable. Yet each morning, he woke to the same surprising normalcy. Guards exchanged words with them, sometimes even smiles. The air was filled not with screams, but with the distant laughter of men playing baseball in the yards beyond the wire. It was in that uneasy calm that Haruto began to sense something shifting inside him. He could not name it yet. It was too strange, too dangerous to acknowledge, but the stories of merciless enemies that had shaped his very soul seemed to clash violently with the world he now lived in. Kenji clung to suspicion, muttering that it was all deception, but Haruto found himself watching the guards' faces, searching for cracks, waiting for the moment when masks would fall away. Yet the days rolled on, and the masks remained the same. Not masks at all, but genuine, if foreign, humanity. The camp was not freedom, but neither was it the hell they had been taught to expect. And as the sun dipped behind the horizon each evening, painting the sky with colors that reminded Haruto of summers long past in Japan, he wondered what other surprises this strange captivity still held. The camp settled into a rhythm that seemed at once monotonous and unsettlingly gentle. Haruto could not reconcile this place with the warnings shouted into his ears during training. Americans will burn your soul before they kill you. The irony was that instead of fire and cruelty, he awoke each morning to the smell of coffee, drifting faintly from the guards' quarters and the sight of a sky vast enough to make him feel small in ways the battlefield never had. Work details filled part of the day. Haruto and Kenji, along with other prisoners, were assigned to clear brush at the edges of the camp or unload supplies that came rattling in on trucks. The work was hard, but not brutal. Guards barked orders, but their tone was practical, not sadistic. Occasionally, one would attempt a few words in broken Japanese, producing laughter among the men. What struck Haruto most was not the tasks themselves, but the absence of humiliation. Back home, their commanders had drilled into them that a defeated soldier was less than human, yet here he was treated with a measure of dignity he scarcely understood. At mealtimes, the prisoners sat in rows, tin trays in hand. The food was foreign, meat stews, bread, beans, but nourishing. Kenji often poked suspiciously at his portion, whispering, "Poisoned, surely." Haruto tasted cautiously, at first bracing for bitterness or sickness. Instead, flavor bloomed on his tongue, different from rice and fish, yet strangely comforting in its warmth. He ate, and soon even Kenji followed, hunger overcoming mistrust. But it was not the food or the work that unsettled Haruto most. It was the strange freedom within confinement. Beyond the fence, American towns lay within reach of imagination. Sometimes local farmers came near to trade with the camp. Haruto overheard their voices, caught sight of their children chasing dogs across fields, and realized with a start that these enemies lived lives no different from his own family across the sea. A pang of homesickness struck him sharper than any wound. The greatest surprise came on a humid afternoon when a guard opened the door to a long, low building near the camp's center and gestured the prisoners inside. Haruto stepped into a large hall where wooden benches lined up before a platform. On that platform, to his astonishment, sat a machine with dials and speakers. The guard turned a knob and suddenly voices filled the air, not voices in the room, voices from nowhere. Haruto's breath caught. A ripple of shock ran through the prisoners. The sound was a radio broadcast, lively and warm. Music followed, unlike any Haruto had heard. Fast, rhythmic, full of energy that made the foot tap without permission. Jazz, though he did not know the word. Kenji stared in disbelief, whispering, "Demons." Haruto could not explain it either. How could voices and music travel through air, across distance, into a box of wires and wood? Back home, radios existed, but were rare treasures of the wealthy. To hear one here, in a prison camp of all places, shattered something inside him. The guard seemed amused by their awe. One tried to explain, speaking slowly, gesturing at the machine, but his words were lost in the fog of language. Yet the meaning was clear. This was not magic, but a tool of daily life in America. For the first time since capture, Haruto felt not fear, but wonder. Evenings stretched long in the camp, filled with idle chatter, whispered regrets, and memories shared among prisoners. But one evening, the guards announced something extraordinary. They led the men once again to the hall, darkened now with a white sheet stretched across the far wall. Haruto frowned, uncertain, until a beam of light pierced the room and images began to flicker across the sheet. People moved, dancing, laughing, speaking in a way that seemed alive and unreal. A film. The prisoners gasped, some covering their mouths in shock. Moving pictures were not wholly unknown in Japan, but in the midst of war and ruin, they seemed like treasures of another century. Here, in captivity, to see such a thing felt like stepping into a dream. Haruto watched the story unfold, though he understood little of the English words. It did not matter. The images of joy, romance, and comedy transcended language. At one point, Kenji laughed, an unguarded, honest laugh that startled even himself. That night, lying in his bunk, Haruto felt a disquiet he could not shake. He had been prepared for pain, degradation, even death. He had not been prepared for radios that carried invisible voices, for moving pictures that stirred laughter from weary souls. He thought of his younger sister who loved stories, and wondered if she would ever see such marvels. For the first time, he asked himself, if the enemy lived with such wonders, what else had he been wrong about? And yet, the questions brought guilt. Was he betraying the spirit of his ancestors by finding wonder in enemy gifts? Was his awe proof of weakness? He closed his eyes, torn between indoctrination and awakening curiosity, the weight of shame wrestling with the spark of something dangerous, admiration. The camp slept, but Haruto lay awake, listening to the faint hum of a generator that powered the radio and the projector. It was as if the machines whispered to him in the darkness, telling him that the world was larger, stranger, and perhaps kinder than he had ever believed. The days passed with a peculiar rhythm, and Haruto began to notice how much sound defined the camp. At first, silence had dominated, the silence of defeat, the silence of men who no longer believed their lives belonged to them. But gradually, new sounds entered, the thud of a baseball hitting a mitt, the hum of trucks rolling by, the creak of benches as prisoners leaned closer to catch the latest voice from the radio. Haruto remembered his first time hearing the broadcast vividly. Now, as evenings came, he found himself waiting for it. The guards sometimes carried the radio outside, setting it on a wooden crate, letting music spill into the open air. The prisoners gathered in clusters, some pretending indifference, others leaning forward like children hearing a fairy tale. The music was strange, swinging rhythms, horns and drums weaving patterns unlike anything from Japan. It was restless, full of life, almost rebellious. Haruto could not help but feel a stirring in his chest, as if the music touched something buried beneath his layers of training and obedience. Kenji resisted at first. "It's poison for the mind," he muttered one evening, glaring at the glowing radio. "They want us to forget who we are." Yet Haruto noticed how Kenji's foot tapped against the dirt unconsciously, keeping time with the beat. The younger man realized it too, abruptly stilling his leg, scowling in frustration at his own betrayal. Haruto did not laugh. He understood. For both of them, the radio was dangerous precisely because it was beautiful. Sometimes the broadcasts were not music, but news. The words rushed past in English, difficult for the prisoners to grasp. Yet bits were translated by those who understood more, and soon rumors spread through the camp. The Americans were advancing. Cities in Europe had fallen. The war was changing. Haruto felt his stomach tighten. For months, he had lived in the assumption that Japan's glory was inevitable, its endurance unquestionable. But here, across the ocean, the voices from the air painted a different story, one of retreats, losses, and shadows looming over the empire. The contradiction gnawed at him. Could the radio lie? Or had the officers back home lied instead? The thought was dangerous, but it grew louder with each broadcast. When he closed his eyes, Haruto saw his father's face, stern and unyielding, speaking of honor and duty. Then he saw the faces of the guards, relaxed, joking, alive. Which vision was truer? Which belonged to the real world, and which to a dream? One evening, the radio crackled with a program unlike any before. A comedy sketch played, full of voices, acting out absurd situations. Though Haruto understood almost none of the words, the rhythm of the audience's laughter, the exaggerated tones of the performers, carried across language. He found himself smiling despite confusion, the sound of laughter infectious. The camp, for a brief time, felt less like a cage and more like a theater. Men leaned against fences, chuckling, shaking their heads at jokes they barely comprehended, united not by understanding, but by the shared relief of joy. Later, lying on his bunk, Haruto thought of how sound carried beyond fences. The radio waves did not stop at barbed wire. Somewhere in the towns beyond, families listened to the same broadcasts. Children tapped their feet to the same songs. Soldiers returning home laughed at the same sketches. In that realization, a strange closeness formed in his heart. Enemies, yes, but hearing the same voices, the same music. How different could they truly be? Kenji noticed Haruto's distant look. "Don't let it soften you," he warned. "Our Families suffer while we sit here listening to their music. Never forget that. His words were sharp, but his voice carried exhaustion more than conviction. Haruto only nodded. Yet inside, a quiet rebellion stirred, not against his country, but against the belief that walls of hatred could never be crossed. As the summer deepened, the sound of cicadas mixed with jazz melodies in Haruto's memory, forming a strange new harmony. The radio had become a bridge, invisible yet undeniable. He began to dream differently at night, not of gunfire and death, but of voices carried through air, binding distant worlds together. One night, after the camp had quieted, Haruto lay awake and imagined his sister in their village, sitting near the family's small shrine. He pictured her hearing the same music, the same laughter. He imagined her smiling, even if she could not understand the words. The thought ached within him, sharp yet comforting. Perhaps one day, when this madness of war ended, she would live in a world where such sounds were not foreign, but familiar. The voices from the radio continued, tireless, bridging chasms carved by blood and propaganda. Haruto listened, not only with his ears but with his soul, feeling each note loosen the chains of fear that had bound him since capture. In the end, it was not guns or guards that began to change him. It was the sound of unseen voices drifting through the night air, telling him that the world was larger, brighter, and more connected than he had ever been allowed to believe. The projector rattled like an old engine, its beam cutting through the dim air of the camp hall. At first, the prisoners had entered with suspicion, unsure what awaited them in the darkened space. But when the first film had played weeks earlier, disbelief gave way to wonder. Now, each time the guards announced another movie night, the men stirred with anticipation, whispering as they filed in, like schoolboys eager for a forbidden treat. Haruto sat near the back, the flickering light spilling across his face. The images on the screen danced with a fluidity that no painting or photograph could capture. People moved, laughed, kissed, stumbled into trouble, and found their way out again, all within the span of an evening. The stories varied: a slapstick comedy with men tripping over chairs, a romance with longing gazes across crowded rooms, even a western where horses thundered across open plains. Each film carried with it not only a story, but a glimpse into the lives of the people beyond the barbed wire, the world of his captors. Kenji often muttered criticisms during the shows. Foolishness, nothing but lies. Look how they mock seriousness, how they turn life into a game. Yet Haruto noticed the way Kenji's eyes shone when a character triumphed against odds, or how his shoulders relaxed during a love story. Even those who resisted could not entirely shut out the magic of the moving pictures. The films unsettled Haruto in ways the radio had not. Music and voices were ephemeral, but the flickering light created a whole other world before his eyes, a world so vivid it seemed almost reachable. He began to wonder about the actors. Were they alive, living somewhere in this vast country? Did ordinary Americans really laugh so freely, live so boldly, or was it only an illusion crafted for entertainment? He had been raised to see the enemy as a faceless mass, but now faces appeared before him, human and imperfect, yet radiant with vitality. During one particular screening, Haruto found himself transfixed by a scene of a family gathered around a dinner table. The father carved a roast, the mother poured drinks, children passed plates with laughter. It was nothing spectacular, but the ordinariness of it pierced him like a blade. He thought of his own family back home, his father stern and tired from years of labor, his mother carefully arranging bowls of rice, his sister's giggle as she tried to steal a piece of fish before the meal began. The film had transported him not into America, but back into his own home, making him realize how similar both worlds truly were. Tears pricked his eyes before he forced them back, unwilling to be seen as weak. The guards, too, seemed to enjoy the screenings. They leaned against the walls, chuckling at jokes, nudging one another during thrilling scenes. Sometimes they shared popcorn, its buttery smell drifting through the hall. Haruto watched them from the corner of his eye, struck by how ordinary they seemed. Boys, really, only a few years older or younger than himself. War had cast them as monsters, but here, illuminated by the same flickering light, They were simply men sharing in the universal act of watching a story. After each film, as the prisoners shuffled back to their barracks, the night sky stretched wide and silent above them. Yet the air felt different, charged by what they had seen. Discussions broke out in whispers. What did that ending mean? Why? Did the lovers part? How could men ride horses so fast without falling? The prisoners argued, laughed, and wondered, their imaginations freed for a time from the weight of captivity. One night, after a particularly joyous comedy, Haruto lingered outside, reluctant to return to his bunk. The moon cast pale light over the fence, and beyond it, he saw the shadowy shapes of fields stretching into the horizon. He thought of how, somewhere out there, American families might also have watched the same film, laughing in theaters or living rooms. For a brief moment, the fence felt less like a wall and more like a thin line separating two worlds that were not so different after all. But guilt gnawed at him afterward. Was it betrayal to laugh at enemy films? To marvel at their inventions? To admit, even silently, that their lives carried beauty and joy? The teachings of his commanders clashed with the evidence of his senses. He had been told Americans were decadent, weak, and cruel. Yet the projector revealed families, friendships, courage, and love. Could such qualities belong to monsters? Or had the truth always been more complicated? The nights of flickering light became more than entertainment. They became mirrors, reflecting both the enemy's humanity and the prisoner's own longings. Haruto began to sense an ache deep within him, a yearning not only for home, but for a world where these marvels of sound and light could exist without chains of hatred binding them. He wondered if he would ever again sit in a theater, free, with his sister tugging at his sleeve, eyes wide in delight. The projector whirred to silence, but its light lingered in Haruto's mind long after. In the stillness of the barracks, he closed his eyes and saw the flicker of images, the laughter, the music. War had taken so much from him, but within these walls, it had also given him something unexpected, a glimpse of possibility, a fragile bridge of light stretching across the abyss between enemies. Autumn crept across the camp slowly, painting the trees beyond the fence with gold and crimson. The air grew cooler, and with it, a strange quietness settled among the prisoners. The novelty of radios and films had not faded, but their impact had deepened. What once had been simple astonishment was now reflection. For Haruto, each note of music, each flicker of light seemed to push him further into a space he had never dared enter. A place where the enemy was no longer monstrous, but human. Life in the camp had become bearable, even orderly. Work assignments continued. Hauling logs, mending fences, assisting farmers in nearby fields, but cruelty never arrived. Sometimes guards offered cigarettes, or even shared jokes, clumsy but earnest. One afternoon, while loading crates, Haruto watched a guard wipe sweat from his brow and grin. The image struck him. There was no hatred in that expression, no desire for dominance, only fatigue and humor. It was the face of a man who could have been his neighbor back home. Kenji noticed the change in Haruto's demeanor. "You're softening," he whispered one night, his tone sharp but his eyes uncertain. "Don't let their tricks fool you. Remember what they've done to our cities. Remember our families." Haruto nodded, but his silence spoke louder than agreement. He remembered, yes, but he also remembered the laughter in the hall, the kindness in small gestures, the astonishing technology that filled the air with voices and stories. He remembered the way the projector revealed a family not unlike his own. He could not erase those truths, no matter how sternly he clung to the past. The war's progress filtered in through rumors and snatches of radio news. Japan's setbacks multiplied. Haruto wrestled with fear. Fear for his family, fear for his homeland, fear of what would await him if he ever returned. Yet amid the fear, something else took root. An understanding that the enemy's world was not one of shadows and lies, but of complexity and contradiction. They were capable of destruction, yes, but also of music, humor, compassion. The realization unsettled him, yet also gave him hope. One evening, After a film that ended with a soldier returning home to embrace his mother, Haruto felt an ache so sharp he thought he might cry. He left the hall quickly, stepping into the crisp night air. The stars glittered above, distant and eternal. A guard stood nearby, lighting a cigarette. For a moment, their eyes met. Neither spoke, yet Haruto sensed something pass between them, an unspoken recognition that both were sons, both longed for home, both carried burdens of war not of their making. Days slipped into weeks, and the prisoners began to change in subtle ways. They smiled more often, exchanged stories not only of battles but of gardens, festivals, and childhood games. The guards, too, grew less rigid, sometimes allowing extra moments of conversation or turning a blind eye to small disobediences. Quiet trust was forming, fragile but undeniable. Haruto realized the transformation most clearly when Kenji, once so suspicious, joined him in humming a tune from the radio. They sat side by side, their voices low, unsure of the words but carried by the melody. It was not surrender. It was survival of a different kind, survival through shared humanity. The nights of flickering light and the voices carried through the air had done what weapons never could. They had breached the walls inside the prisoners' hearts. Haruto no longer saw his captors only as enemies. He saw them as men who laughed, men who dreamed, men who wanted to return home just as he did. The realization did not erase the pain of war or the loyalty he still felt to Japan, but it reshaped his understanding of the world. Winter approached, and rumors spread that the war might be nearing its end. Haruto felt both dread and hope. What would happen when he returned to Japan? Would he be shamed for surviving? Condemned for being captured? Would he ever be able to speak of what he had seen? Of radios that carried laughter across oceans? Of films that revealed the universal language of longing? Of kindness from those once painted as monsters? Perhaps not. Yet deep inside, he knew the experiences would remain with him forever, shaping the man he would become. On his final night in the camp before transfer, Haruto sat alone beneath the barbed wire fence, listening to the faint hum of the radio drifting from the guardhouse. A slow, tender song played, its melody curling into the cold night air. He closed his eyes, imagining his sister hearing the same tune one day, imagining a future where such sounds crossed borders not to taunt or conquer, but to connect. For the first time since capture, Haruto allowed himself to believe in a future beyond war. A future where astonishment at radios and movie nights would give way to shared experiences, to the possibility that enemies could, through simple acts of humanity, become something more. And as the song faded into silence, he whispered, "Into the night, not as a soldier or a prisoner, but as a man. We are not so different."